Have you ever found yourself trapped in a story you couldn't escape, where every word seems to twist reality around you? Elias Thorne wasn't just any writer. Once celebrated for his gripping novels, he now sat defeated, his creativity drained, plagued by a crippling writer's block. Desperate for inspiration, he wandered the quiet streets one late afternoon, his footsteps leading him to a forgotten alleyway. At the end of it stood an old, weathered bookstore, its sign barely readable under the grime of decades. It was as if the place called to him, pulling him in with an eerie sense of familiarity. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of ancient pages, and the dim light barely illuminated the rows of books stacked haphazardly. There, hidden between dust-covered tomes, Elias found a manuscript, its leather cover cracked and worn, pages yellowed with age. As his fingers brushed against it, a chill ran down his spine. The title was faded, but something about the book felt disturbingly personal. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, forced him to open it. What he found within those pages was more than just a story. It was a mirror to his own life, written with terrifying precision. The protagonist's thoughts, his struggles, his darkest secrets, they were Elias' own. But how could this be? Each word seemed to bind him closer to the story, like invisible chains tightening around his soul. As he read further, something began to shift. The room seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening as if they had a life of their own. In the distance, a faint rhythmic creaking echoed through the air. Was it the building settling? Or something far more sinister? Could it be possible? Could a story predict your fate? Elias's hands trembled as he closed the manuscript, but the fear had already taken root deep inside him. He knew he had to uncover the truth, or risk becoming the next victim of its cursed narrative. Before we dive further into this chilling tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. You'll need all the support you can get as we unravel the terrifying mystery behind the Unfinished Manuscript. Because some stories don't just end, they consume you. Elias couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to him after discovering the manuscript. That night, as he lay in bed, the images from the pages haunted his mind. Exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep, but his dreams were anything but peaceful. It began subtly, a familiar setting, his own study, dimly lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp. The air in the room felt heavier, almost oppressive, like it was thick with something unseen. A faint ticking sound echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, though there was no clock in sight. As Elias turned to face his desk, the manuscript lay open before him, its pages fluttering despite the absence of any breeze. The words on the pages seemed to shift and change, forming sentences that hadn't been there before, sentences that whispered ominously in the silence. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they grazed the edge of the paper. A shiver shot down his spine as the temperature in the room plummeted. The smell of something damp and rotten began to creep into the air, an unmistakable scent of decay that felt too real for a mere dream. Suddenly, he wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, he could hear the faintest breath, slow, deliberate, almost taunting. He froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His eyes darted towards the shadowy corner where something seemed to move just beyond the reach of the light. It was subtle, like a ripple in the darkness, a figure that shouldn't be there. The dream was unnervingly familiar yet deeply unsettling, as though he had lived this moment before. The sensation of déjà vu washed over him, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. Elias wanted to wake up, but his body refused to move. His breath quickened, the ticking growing louder now, like a countdown to something inevitable. The figure in the corner began to take shape, its presence heavy and menacing, but its face remained obscured, shrouded in darkness. A whisper cut through the silence, soft but sharp, carrying a chilling message that echoed in his mind. "You're next." Elias jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The room was silent, still, but the manuscript sat on his desk, open to the exact page he had dreamt about. He hadn't left it like that, had he? The next day, Elias tried to brush off the nightmare, convincing himself it was just a manifestation of his overworked mind. But the uneasy feeling refused to leave him. The manuscript remained on his desk, almost mocking him with its presence, but he couldn't resist its pull. As evening fell and the shadows lengthened in his study, he picked it up again, hoping to make sense of the disturbing connection between the story and his own life. Each word seemed to dig deeper into his psyche, and soon Elias found himself lost in its pages once more. But this time, something was different. The air around him felt colder, heavier, as if the room was pressing in on him. The faint scent of mildew filled his nostrils, a damp, musty odor that hadn't been there moments before. As he read, he noticed something that sent a chill down his spine. The details in the manuscript had changed. New passages had appeared, ones that described his actions in real time. It detailed the exact moment he picked up his cup of coffee, the sound of the chair creaking beneath him, and the quiet hum of the city outside. It was as though the manuscript was watching him, recording his every move. The feeling of being observed intensified. The ticking sound from his dream returned, faint but unmistakable, growing louder with each breath he took. He glanced around the room, eyes darting to the corners, expecting to see the same shadowy figure from his nightmare. Nothing. But the feeling of unease gnawed at him, an invisible presence lingering just beyond his sight. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling of papers, the creaking of floorboards, each one making his skin crawl. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. Elias jumped, his heart pounding in his chest. The manuscript slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. For a moment, he was paralyzed, fear gripping him in place. He strained to listen, but the house was eerily silent again, save for the ever-present ticking. Was it real? Or had his mind begun to unravel under the weight of the manuscript's sinister influence? Gathering his courage, Elias rose from his chair, his steps cautious and deliberate. As he descended the stairs, the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. The air was thick with tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped in his tracks. There, on the floor, was a single page from the manuscript, one he had never seen before. Its words were written in a shaky hand, and as he bent down to read, his blood ran cold. It described the exact moment he stood at the foot of the stairs, staring at the page in his trembling hands. It was no longer just a story. It was a warning. Elias realized that whatever was happening, it was far from over. That night, Elias fell into an even deeper, more terrifying dream, one that gripped him from the moment his eyes closed. He found himself back in his study, but this time the room felt wrong, warped as though reality itself was fraying at the edges. The ticking sound was louder now, rhythmic and insistent, pounding in his ears like the relentless march of time running out. Shadows twisted and stretched across the walls, their movements unnaturally fluid, almost alive. The manuscript lay open on his desk, but now it seemed to pulse, as if the pages themselves were breathing, feeding off the darkness around them. Elias approached the desk with trepidation, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the small room. As he reached for the manuscript, the room's temperature plummeted, his breath visible in the frigid air. His fingers brushed the page, and suddenly, the words rearranged themselves before his eyes, morphing into new lines of text that sent a wave of dread crashing over him. The page described his exact actions in real time, each hesitant step, each shallow breath. Then it detailed something more chilling. He turns to face the window, and there it stands. Before Elias could process what he had read, an overwhelming sense of dread gripped him. He felt an invisible force pulling him toward the window, as if something beyond the glass was waiting, watching. His body moved against his will, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he turned, his eyes locking onto the window's darkened reflection. And there, standing just outside, was a figure, tall, faceless, shrouded in a cloak of shadows. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was suffocating, radiating a malevolent energy that made his blood run cold. The ticking stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. Elias stared, paralyzed with fear, as the figure slowly raised a hand, its movements deliberate and unnatural. A long, thin finger tapped against the glass, each tap resonating in the stillness like a death knell. Elias's chest tightened as panic set in. But no matter how much he willed himself to move, his body refused to obey. It was as though the figure had complete control over him, like a puppet master pulling invisible strings. Suddenly, with a jarring, gut-wrenching sound, the glass shattered. The figure surged forward, engulfing the room in darkness as it reached for Elias. He screamed, but no sound escaped his throat. In an instant, everything went black. Elias jolted awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding violently in his chest. He was back in his bed, the room quiet and still. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign that the nightmare had followed him into the waking world. That's when he noticed it. A single shard of broken glass lying on the floor near the window. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a dream. The nightmare had left a scar on reality. Terrified, Elias looked toward the desk. The manuscript was still there, open to a new page. The words on it were chilling. "You cannot escape." Elias's hands shook as he stared at the broken shard of glass on the floor. The air in his room felt thick with dread, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The nightmare wasn't just a product of his mind. It had bled into reality, and now Elias was trapped in its grip. With a growing sense of panic, he approached the manuscript. His breath hitched when he saw that the words had shifted once again, forming new passages that detailed his every action, even the hesitation in his steps as he approached the desk. But something far more disturbing caught his eye. The manuscript now described events from his past, secrets only he could know, buried deep within his memory. The pages mentioned an incident from his childhood, a night he had long since repressed. He had been no older than 7, walking home through the woods near his house when he saw something unnatural, a figure, much like the one from his dream, standing still among the trees, watching him from a distance. Elias had never spoken of it, dismissing it as a figment of his youthful imagination. But here it was, written in eerie detail within the manuscript, as though someone had been there with him, recording every terrifying moment. Elias felt his blood run cold. How could this manuscript know about that night? He had told no one, not even himself, in years. His mind raced as he flipped through the pages, each one revealing another piece of his past, moments of fear, of trauma, that he had long since buried. It was as though the manuscript was not only predicting his future, but unraveling his deepest, darkest memories, pulling them to the surface where they could no longer be ignored. The line between reality and fiction had begun to blur, and Elias found himself questioning whether these events had truly been forgotten, or if they had been waiting all along for the right moment to resurface. Desperate for answers, Elias decided to investigate the origins of the manuscript. He visited the old bookstore where he had first found it, only to discover that the shop had been closed for years. The owner, an elderly man, had mysteriously disappeared, leaving the shop abandoned. Local rumors swirled about the old man dabbling in dark, forbidden rituals tied to ancient texts. Elias's heart raced as he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. With each passing day, the connections between the manuscript and his reality grew stronger. Events from the story started manifesting in his life with increasing intensity. The creaking floorboards, the shifting shadows, and even the ticking sound that haunted his dreams now echoed through his home. But the most horrifying discovery came when Elias uncovered an old photo of the bookstore's previous owner. Staring back at him from the faded image was the same faceless figure from his nightmare. Elias realized with chilling clarity that the manuscript wasn't just a reflection of his life. It was a trap. It was pulling him into its cursed narrative, erasing the boundary between the written word and the real world. And the worst part? The story wasn't finished. If he didn't find a way to stop it, the manuscript would consume him, just as it had done to others before him. Elias's mind was unraveling. Every day, the manuscript seemed to grow stronger, its hold on him tightening like a noose. His once quiet, uneventful life had become a waking nightmare, each moment haunted by the chilling presence that seemed to follow him. Shadows crept along the edges of his vision, whispers echoed through the halls of his home, and the ticking, always that infernal ticking, never ceased. Desperation clawed at him, and Elias knew that if he didn't find answers soon, he would be lost forever. Another victim claimed by the manuscript's sinister curse. Determined to uncover the truth, Elias began his search for someone who could help him decipher the manuscript's dark origins. He remembered an old colleague, Dr. Miriam Keats, an expert in rare texts and ancient rituals, who had once warned him about the dangers of forbidden knowledge. He hadn't taken her seriously back then, dismissing her words as eccentric ramblings. But now, he needed her expertise more than ever. The manuscript's grip was tightening and time was running out. Elias contacted Miriam, his voice barely steady as he explained the terrifying events that had been unfolding. Her silence on the other end of the line was unnerving, and when she finally spoke, her tone was grave. "Elias," she whispered, "what you're dealing with is more than just a cursed book. It's a ritual, a binding. The manuscript doesn't just tell stories, it creates them. It takes hold of your life, rewriting it as you read. Every word pulls you deeper into its narrative, and once you're fully trapped, there's no escape." Miriam agreed to meet Elias in person, but her urgency only deepened his fear. She had studied similar cases, writers, poets, and scholars who had vanished after discovering mysterious texts that seemed to blur the line between fiction and reality. Their disappearances were never solved, but Miriam had uncovered disturbing evidence suggesting they had been consumed by the stories they read, their fates sealed by the very words they had written or discovered. As Elias made his way to her secluded cabin, the road twisted through a dense, oppressive forest. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. The deeper he drove, the more he felt like he was descending into another world, one where reality had no solid footing. The ticking followed him, growing louder, reverberating in his skull, until it seemed to sync with his heartbeat. His breath came in shallow gasps as he approached the cabin, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. When he arrived, Miriam greeted him with a somber expression. She ushered him inside, her cabin filled with ancient books and strange symbols etched into the walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and a fire crackled low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Miriam wasted no time. She spread the manuscript across a large wooden table, her brow furrowed in concentration as she examined the cryptic text. "There's something here," she muttered, her fingers tracing the faded words. The original author, whoever they were, was trying to complete a ritual of some kind, but it went wrong. They became trapped in their own story, and now the manuscript searches for new hosts to finish what they started. It feeds on the fear, the uncertainty, the very life force of those who read it. Miriam's voice dropped to a whisper. "Elias, you've already started the process. The manuscript is rewriting your fate as we speak." A chill settled over Elias as Miriam revealed the only way to sever the manuscript's hold. He had to finish the story, but the ending wasn't his to write. The manuscript had a mind of its own, and it demanded a sacrifice, a choice that would determine whether Elias lived or became another ghost within its pages. The weight of this realization pressed down on him like a heavy shroud. Elias felt the terror rise in his chest, but he had no choice. If he didn't act soon, the manuscript would finish the story for him, and he feared the ending would be far more horrifying than anything he could imagine. As Miriam handed Elias an ancient dagger, her eyes filled with a grim understanding. The ticking grew louder still. His journey into darkness had only just begun. Elias stood at the threshold of an unspeakable decision, the ancient dagger heavy in his hand. The cabin's dim light flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch and writhe as though alive. The ticking was louder now, relentless, echoing through the room like a death march. He could feel the manuscript's presence, a malevolent force pulsing with anticipation, waiting for him to take the next step. The words on its pages whispered in his mind, urging him forward, promising salvation. But Elias knew better. The manuscript didn't offer freedom. It demanded submission. Miriam watched from across the table, her face pale but resolute. "You must confront it, Elias. You have to bring the story to its conclusion, or it will write the ending for you," she warned, her voice trembling slightly. She knew the risks, but there was no turning back. The manuscript had woven itself into Elias's life, and now it was dragging him toward the final chapter. With the dagger in hand, Elias felt the weight of his impending choice. He knew the manuscript was guiding him toward the source of its power, the dark force that had claimed its previous victims. He needed to face it, to confront whatever had been controlling his fate since the moment he picked up the cursed book. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the manuscript, its pages fluttering despite the still air. The words on the page began to shift, rearranging themselves into a new passage, one that sent chills through his body. The door opens, and he steps through. Elias's eyes widened as the cabin door creaked open on its own, revealing a dense fog outside, swirling with shadows that twisted and flickered in the night. A dark figure stood at the edge of the fog, waiting. It was the same figure that had haunted his dreams, the same faceless presence that had been watching him since the beginning. Its cloak billowed in the wind, its form barely discernible, but its intent was unmistakable. It was here to claim him. The air grew colder as Elias stepped outside, his breath visible in the chilling night air. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating him with a sense of dread so deep it threatened to consume him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew there was no escape. The manuscript had led him here, and now he had to face whatever horror lay behind that dark veil. As Elias approached, the figure finally stirred, raising a hand in a slow, deliberate motion. Its voice, when it spoke, was not human. It was a rasping whisper, like the wind through dead leaves, and it spoke directly to Elias's mind. "Finish the story, Elias. The ending is yours to choose." The words were a taunt, a twisted mockery of the power he thought he had over his own fate. Elias realized then that the manuscript had never been about telling a story. It had been about control, about forcing him to accept his place in a narrative that was far older and darker than he had ever imagined. With shaking hands, Elias raised the dagger, ready to confront the figure. But before he could strike, the shadows surged forward, enveloping him in a suffocating darkness. The world around him twisted, warping into a nightmarish vision of his past, present, and future, all colliding at once. He saw flashes of his life, his childhood, his struggles as a writer, the people he had loved and lost, all flickering like broken film. And at the center of it all, he saw himself, trapped within the pages of the manuscript, his life nothing more than a story being written and rewritten by forces beyond his comprehension. The figure's voice echoed in his mind once more. "Sacrifice yourself or sacrifice another. That is the only way this story ends." The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. The manuscript demanded a choice, a brutal ultimatum. Either Elias would take his own life to end the cursed narrative, or someone else would suffer in his place, forever trapped in the manuscript's clutches. The dagger in his hand felt impossibly heavy, its cold steel biting into his skin. Could he do it? Could he sacrifice himself to end the nightmare? But just as he wavered, a horrifying thought struck him. What if the manuscript was lying? What if, no matter his choice, the story would continue, claiming victim after victim in an endless cycle of terror? The fog thickened around him, the shadows closing in. Time was running out. He had to decide. With a scream of defiance, Elias plunged the dagger into the figure's chest, hoping, praying, that this would break the curse. But as the blade sank into the dark form, the figure didn't react. Instead, its faceless head tilted as if in amusement, and it spoke one final time. "The story never ends, Elias. Not for you." In that moment, Elias was pulled back into the real world with a jolt, standing once more in Miriam's cabin. But something was wrong. The ticking had stopped, the shadows gone, and Miriam stood, frozen, her eyes wide with terror. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed toward the manuscript. It had changed again. New words, new pages. Elias's heart sank as he read the final line. And now another takes his place. The story wasn't over. It never would be. Elias stared at the manuscript, his breath caught in his throat. The new words were chilling, their meaning sinking in like a cold knife. And now another takes his place. His heart pounded as he tried to understand who had taken his place. Was it Miriam? Was it someone else? Or was it him? The shadows in the room felt different now, no longer crawling, but watching, waiting. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the faintest whisper of the ticking sound returning. A cruel reminder that time was still playing its twisted game. Miriam stood motionless, her eyes locked on the manuscript, her expression one of sheer horror. She reached out a trembling hand toward Elias, but before she could say anything, the lights in the cabin flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The fire in the hearth sputtered and faded, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. Elias's body tensed, every nerve on edge as the darkness pressed in around them. Feeling more alive than ever, something was out there, just beyond the reach of the light. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest of whispers. The voice was distant at first, almost imperceptible, but as it grew louder, Elias could hear it clearly. It was the same voice from his dreams, the voice of the manuscript itself. The story continues, Elias. You cannot escape. The realization struck him with a force that nearly knocked him to his knees. He had not stopped the manuscript. He had only delayed it. The curse wasn't broken. It was merely passing. Elias turned to Miriam, desperation in his eyes. What do we do now? He whispered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer to the manuscript, her hand trembling as she reached for its cover. As her fingers brushed the leather binding, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Her face contorted in fear as the book began to pulse under her touch, its pages fluttering wildly, as if alive. She tried to pull away, but her hand seemed stuck, bound to the cursed object. "Miriam!" Elias shouted, rushing forward to help her. But as he reached out, the manuscript's pages exploded outward in a blinding flash of light, sending Elias staggering backward. When his vision cleared, he saw Miriam standing completely still, her eyes wide and vacant, her body rigid like a statue. The manuscript lay at her feet, its pages blank, its story finished. Or so it seemed. The silence that followed was unbearable. Elias's heart raced as he knelt beside Miriam, shaking her gently, but she didn't respond. Her body remained frozen, as if her soul had been drained, leaving only an empty shell. The manuscript, now lifeless, had taken her. The curse had claimed another victim, just as it had warned. As the reality of the situation sank in, Elias stumbled back, his mind racing. The ticking had stopped once again, but the feeling of dread remained, lingering like a dark cloud over him. He looked around the cabin, now eerily quiet, and realized with horror that he was alone. The manuscript was gone. Miriam was gone. And all that remained was the suffocating presence of something far more sinister than he had imagined.